On the afternoon of November 14th, 1978, a Tuesday, two FBI agents walked into Kerrigan's pharmacy on North Farwell Avenue in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, a neighborhood pharmacy wedged between a hardware store and a diner, where the biggest excitement most days was whether Mrs. Patterson would remember to bring her insurance card or whether the Packers would beat the Vikings on Sunday. The agents weren't there to pick up prescriptions. They were there because of a phone call made 8 days earlier by a pharmacist who claimed he'd discovered something impossible. Something that, if true, represented one of the most sophisticated Soviet chemical weapons procurement operations ever uncovered on American soil. What the pharmacist had discovered was a systematic network of operatives purchasing precursor chemicals for nerve agents, materials that could be combined to produce military-grade toxins capable of killing thousands. Over the course of the investigation that followed, 7 people would be arrested across 3 states. A covert laboratory would be dismantled. Soviet diplomatic personnel would be expelled. And the way American counterintelligence thought about commercial chemical supply chains and pharmaceutical security would fundamentally change. The pharmacist's name was Daniel Patrick Kerrigan. And to understand what he discovered, you have to understand who he was, what chemicals were being purchased, and what the world looked like in the fall of 1978. The Cold War had been grinding forward for more than 3 decades by the fall of 1978, and while the apocalyptic tensions of the Cuban Missile Crisis had faded into history, the espionage game between the United States and the Soviet Union remained as active and dangerous as ever. The KGB and the CIA still ran agents in each other's capitals. Both sides still tested each other's defenses, probed for weaknesses, and sought advantages in the long twilight struggle that defined the second half of the 20th century. November 1978 sat in a peculiar moment of that struggle. Jimmy Carter had been president for nearly 2 years, preaching human rights and pursuing détente with the Soviets through the SALT II arms limitation talks. But the intelligence community knew what the public didn't, that beneath the diplomatic pleasantries, Soviet intelligence operations on American soil had actually intensified. The invasion of Afghanistan was 13 months away. The election of Ronald Reagan and the resumption of overt Cold War hostility was 2 years in the future. In the meantime, Soviet intelligence services were busy. One of their busiest and most secretive programs involved poison. The Soviet Union had been developing chemical weapons and toxins for intelligence operations since 1921, when Vladimir Lenin authorized the creation of what became known as the Special Office, a laboratory tasked with developing poisons for eliminating enemies of the state. By 1939, under the supervision of NKVD Chief Lavrenti Beria, the program had expanded into Laboratory 1, headed by biochemist Grigory Marinovsky, who tested his concoctions on political prisoners from the gulags. The objective was simple: to create tasteless, odorless, undetectable poisons that could be administered to targets without leaving forensic evidence. The program evolved over decades. By the 1970s, Soviet chemical weapons scientists at the GOSNIIOKHT State Research Institute in Shekhani, a closed city in southwestern Russia that the KGB sealed off from outside visitors, had developed a new class of nerve agents under a program codenamed Foliant. These agents, collectively known as Novichok, Russian for newcomer, were designed to be more lethal than anything the Americans had, and critically, to evade detection through a clever innovation called binary weapons. The concept was elegant. Instead of manufacturing a complete nerve agent, which was dangerous to produce, difficult to transport, and easy for intelligence services to detect, Soviet scientists developed agents that could be assembled from 2 separate precursor chemicals. Each precursor was relatively harmless on its own, and more importantly, each had legitimate industrial applications. Dimethylaminoethanol could be used in pharmaceutical synthesis. Methylphosphonic dichloride was a component in pesticide manufacturing. Phosphorus trichloride had applications in plastics production. When purchased separately by different people at different times from different locations, these chemicals arouse no suspicion whatsoever. But when combined in the correct ratios following specific synthesis protocols, they produce compounds like A230 and A234, nerve agents that Soviet scientists claimed were 5 to 10 times more potent than VX, which was already considered the deadliest chemical weapon ever created. American intelligence agencies knew the Soviets were working on something. CIA briefings in 1976 had suggested Soviet development of binary chemical weapons using Western commercial chemicals, but the specifics remained classified and fragmentary. The FBI's counterintelligence division had been tasked with identifying Soviet procurement networks, but their investigations had focused on industrial chemical suppliers, university laboratories, and defense contractors, places where bulk quantities of suspicious materials might be purchased. No one had seriously considered retail pharmacies. Daniel Patrick Kerrigan owned and operated Kerrigan's Pharmacy at 2847 North Farwell Avenue, a modest storefront with a bell above the door that rang whenever customers entered, wooden shelves stocked with aspirin and cough syrup and heating pads, and a pharmacy counter at the back where Kerrigan filled prescriptions with the same meticulous care a watchmaker might use assembling a timepiece. He was 47 years old in the fall of 1978. He'd been a pharmacist for 25 years. And he was exactly the kind of person who might notice something that everyone else would miss. Kerrigan had been born on March 15, 1931, in Milwaukee's Bayview neighborhood, the second of 4 children in an Irish-American Catholic family where faith and work were the organizing principles of life. His father, Patrick Sr., was a foreman at the A.O. Smith steel plant on the South Side. His mother, Catherine, kept house and raised children, and somehow managed to stretch a foreman's salary to feed 6 people through the Depression and the war years. The Kerrigans weren't poor, but they weren't comfortable either. They were working class in the way that meant something specific in Milwaukee in those years: steady employment, a modest home, children who went to parochial school and were expected to make something of themselves. Daniel attended Marquette University on a partial scholarship, enrolling in the pharmacy program in 1949 because it was practical, because pharmacists made decent money, and because his uncle owned a drugstore and had offered him a job after graduation. He was a good student, quiet, thorough, the kind who turned in assignments early and asked detailed questions that sometimes irritated his professors, but that always demonstrated he'd done the reading. He graduated in 1953 with honors and immediately received his draft notice. The Korean War was winding down, but the Army still needed men. Kerrigan was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division as a medic, shipped to Korea in August 1953 just as the armistice was being signed, and spent the next 18 months at a MASH unit near the DMZ treating soldiers who stepped on landmines or got injured in the tense skirmishes that continued even after the official fighting stopped. It was there, in that medical tent with its smell of antiseptic and blood and fear, that Kerrigan learned about poisons and antidotes and what chemicals could do to the human body. He saw men die from phosphorus burns. He treated soldiers exposed to industrial toxins. He learned field toxicology from Army doctors who'd seen things in World War II they didn't talk about except when they were training medics who might need to know. He came home in January 1955, got a job at Sullivan's Pharmacy on the South Side, a place owned by his future father-in-law, and married Margaret O'Connor in June of that year. They had 3 children, Daniel Jr., Kathleen, and Patrick, and lived in a modest 2-story house 4 blocks from where Kerrigan had grown up, close enough to his parents that his mother could watch the children when Margaret worked part-time as a parish secretary. In 1964, when Margaret's father retired, Kerrigan bought the pharmacy, renamed it, and began running it the way he thought a pharmacy should be run, with obsessive attention to detail and a deep suspicion of anything that looked irregular. Most pharmacists kept records because the law required it. Kerrigan kept records because he couldn't help himself. He maintained ledgers that went far beyond what the DEA mandated, tracking not just controlled substances, but patterns in prescriptions, noting which doctors wrote for which medications, at what frequencies, documenting any request that struck him as unusual, even if it was perfectly legal. He created his own classification system for suspicious patterns, color-coding entries, cross-referencing doctors with patients with medications with quantities. His filing system had a filing system. His wife joked that he'd catalog his breakfast cereal if the boxes came with serial numbers. He subscribed to professional journals religiously: Journal of Pharmaceutical Sciences, Journal of the American Medical Association, and somewhat unusually for a retail pharmacist, Chemical and Engineering News, which was aimed primarily at academic and industrial chemists, but which Kerrigan read because he found the technical articles fascinating. He attended every professional development course offered by the Wisconsin Pharmacists Association. He had a photographic memory for chemical nomenclature, could recall IUPAC names and molecular formulas and synthesis pathways with the kind of accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to his employees. One of his pharmacy technicians, a young woman named Susan Kowalski, would later tell FBI investigators that Mr. Kerrigan knew every medication, every interaction, every contraindication without having to look anything up. But more than that, he knew what normal looked like, and when something wasn't normal, he noticed. In 1973, he'd noticed something that wasn't normal. Dr. Robert Hamill was a general practitioner in West Allis, seemingly legitimate, with an office in a medical building and a nurse who answered the phone and appointments that were scheduled through normal channels. But over a 6-month period, from January to June of 1973, Kerrigan filled 847 prescriptions from Dr. Hamill for Percocet and Demerol, all for different patients, all apparently legitimate on the surface. What bothered Kerrigan was the pattern. The prescriptions came in clusters. The same 4 or 5 people kept coming in to pick up medications for relatives who were supposedly homebound or elderly or too sick to come themselves. The quantities were always just below the threshold that would require additional documentation. And the patients' names, when Kerrigan started tracking them, showed no clustering by neighborhood or demographic, which would be normal for a GP whose practice drew from a specific community. Kerrigan spent 3 months documenting every prescription, every pickup, every pattern he could identify. Then he called the DEA. The investigation took another 6 months, but in December 1973, Dr. Hamill was arrested for running a pill mill, taking cash payments from addicts and dealers, writing false prescriptions, and distributing controlled substances illegally. He was convicted, sentenced to 5 years in federal prison, and lost his medical license permanently. The DEA gave Kerrigan a commendation. The FBI's Milwaukee field office made a note in their files that Daniel Kerrigan was reliable, detail-oriented, and someone worth consulting if pharmaceutical issues arose in future investigations. His 3 children grew up watching their father work. Daniel Jr., 22 in 1978, was in his 2nd year of law school at Marquette. Kathleen, 20, was studying nursing at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Patrick, 17, was a senior at Bayview High School, already accepted to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for the following fall. They all remembered their father's study at home, lined with filing cabinets and notebooks, a place where he spent his evenings reviewing ledgers and reading technical journals while their mother knitted and half-watched whatever was on television. Patrick would later recall that his father couldn't let things go, that if something didn't fit the pattern, it bothered him like a pebble in a shoe, and he'd work at it until he understood it or proved it was nothing. Kerrigan's particular cognitive wiring, his photographic memory for chemicals combined with his obsessive systematization and his deep-seated suspicion of irregularities, meant that if someone was doing something wrong with pharmaceuticals or chemicals anywhere in his sphere of awareness, he would probably notice. And if Soviet intelligence officers were systematically purchasing precursor chemicals for nerve agents anywhere in Milwaukee, and if those purchases followed any pattern at all, Daniel Patrick Kerrigan was quite possibly the only person in the city who would see it. The first unusual purchase occurred on September 3, 1978, a Sunday afternoon, 15 minutes before closing time. The man who walked into Kerrigan's pharmacy at 5:45 p.m. was unremarkable in almost every way. Average height, maybe 5'9", dark hair going gray at the temples, age somewhere in his late 30s or early 40s. He wore a windbreaker and khaki pants and moved with the slightly hesitant manner of someone unfamiliar with the layout of a store, glancing at the signs above the aisles, checking his watch, eventually making his way to the pharmacy counter at the back where Kerrigan was processing the day's paperwork. The man had an accent. Eastern European, Kerrigan thought, though he couldn't place it more precisely than that. Polish, maybe, or Russian, or Czech. The man asked if the pharmacy carried dimethylaminoethanol. Kerrigan looked up from his paperwork. Dimethylaminoethanol wasn't a common request. It was a legitimate chemical used in pharmaceutical synthesis and nutritional supplements and some industrial solvent formulations, but most people who needed it ordered from bulk chemical suppliers, not retail pharmacies. The quantity the man requested, 500 grams, was larger than a hobbyist would need, but smaller than an industrial operation would buy. Kerrigan asked what the intended use was. The man said he was formulating an industrial cleaning solvent for a small business and needed a specific grade that his regular supplier couldn't provide on short notice. It wasn't an unreasonable explanation. Kerrigan kept a modest inventory of laboratory chemicals for local businesses and home chemistry enthusiasts, mostly because his father-in-law had maintained that inventory and Kerrigan had continued the practice. He had 500 grams of dimethylaminoethanol in stock. The sale was legal. The chemical wasn't a controlled substance. There was no reason to refuse. But something about the transaction bothered Kerrigan in a way he couldn't immediately articulate. The man seemed nervous, avoiding eye contact, his hands fidgeting with his wallet as he counted out cash for the purchase. $47.85 in bills and coins. No request for a receipt. No business documentation offered. He left quickly after Kerrigan handed him the chemical in its sealed bottle, the bell above the door chiming as he exited onto Farwell Avenue and disappeared into the Sunday evening foot traffic. Kerrigan stood at the counter for a moment, staring at the cash, then at the door. Then he did something he'd been doing for 25 years, whenever something felt off. He pulled out a separate ledger he kept in a locked drawer beneath the register, a notebook with unusual transactions written on the cover in his neat handwriting, and he made an entry. Date, September 3rd, 1978. Time, 5:45 p.m. Physical description, male, late 30s, 5'9", dark hair, gray temples, Eastern European accent. Chemical, dimethylaminoethanol, 500 grain. Stated purpose, industrial cleaning solvent formulation. Payment, cash. No receipt requested. He filed the notebook away and went home for dinner and thought nothing more about it for 2 weeks. On September 18th, a Monday afternoon, a different man came into the pharmacy and requested 750 grams of methylphosphonic dichloride. This man was younger, maybe mid-30s, with similar Slavic features and a comparable accent, though lighter. He claimed he needed the chemical for synthesizing pesticides for an agricultural equipment testing company. Again, The explanation was plausible. Methylphosphonic dichloride had legitimate applications in pesticide manufacturing. Again, the quantity was unusual but not illegal. Again, the man paid cash and left quickly without requesting documentation. Kerrigan made another entry in his ledger. The third purchase happened on September 29th, a Friday. The first man returned, the one from September 3rd with the gray temples. This time, he requested 1 kilogram of triethylamine. Different chemical, same pattern. Cash payment, vague industrial purpose, nervous demeanor. 3 entries. Kerrigan began to pay closer attention. On October 7th, a Saturday, a third individual, a man Kerrigan hadn't seen before, requested phosphorus trichloride. On October 14th, the second man returned for dimethyl sulfoxide. On October 23rd, a fourth man, older than the others, requested sodium fluoride. By the end of October, Kerrigan had documented 12 separate purchases from what appeared to be 5 or 6 different men, all with Eastern European accents, all paying cash, all requesting chemicals that individually raised no red flags, but that collectively struck Kerrigan as forming a pattern. The problem was that he couldn't identify what pattern they formed. He spent his evenings at the kitchen table with his ledger spread open next to reference books and old issues of chemical and engineering news, trying to work out what these chemicals might be used for when combined. Margaret would bring him coffee and ask what he was working on, and he'd say he wasn't sure yet. Something didn't add up, and she'd kiss the top of his head and leave him to his calculations. His first hypothesis was drug manufacturing. Methamphetamine labs needed precursor chemicals, and organized crime was increasingly sophisticated about acquiring materials in ways that avoided DEA scrutiny. Kerrigan pulled out DEA publications on meth lab chemicals, studied the synthesis pathways, cross-referenced them against his list of purchases. Nothing matched. The chemicals his customers had purchased weren't part of any methamphetamine synthesis process. He tried mapping them to other illicit drug pathways: heroin processing, cocaine refinement, fentanyl synthesis. Still nothing. He tried a second hypothesis. Maybe this was an industrial operation trying to avoid the minimum order quantities and bulk pricing requirements of legitimate chemical suppliers. Some small manufacturers, particularly in plastics or specialty coatings, might find it cheaper to buy small quantities from multiple retail sources rather than commit to the large orders that wholesale suppliers required. But when Kerrigan checked Wisconsin business registrations and called a colleague who worked at a Milwaukee industrial chemical supply company, he learned that any legitimate industrial operation would use established suppliers with proper documentation and business accounts. The cost savings from buying retail would be negligible, and the lack of documentation would actually create problems for any business that needed to maintain proper accounting records for tax and regulatory purposes. By mid-October, Kerrigan was convinced the purchases weren't for industrial use. His third hypothesis was academic research. Perhaps a university researcher was conducting experiments that required these specific chemicals and was buying them with cash to avoid the bureaucratic delays of requisitioning through the university system. Graduate students sometimes did this when they needed materials quickly for time-sensitive research. Kerrigan called the chemistry departments at Marquette and the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He didn't mention the specific purchases, just asked in general terms whether any research groups were working with organophosphorus compounds or fluorinating agents. No one was. And when he thought about it more carefully, academic researchers would use university purchasing accounts specifically because those accounts gave them institutional discounts and proper documentation for their research records. No serious researcher would pay retail prices in cash. His fourth hypothesis, which he developed in late October as he reviewed 2 months of entries, was that someone was running a gray market resale operation. Perhaps an entrepreneur was buying chemicals at retail prices from pharmacies and reselling them at a markup to businesses or individuals who couldn't or wouldn't go through normal channels. But the economics didn't work. The margins would be too small. The chemicals weren't in high enough demand to support arbitrage, and the risk of getting caught operating without proper licensing would far outweigh any potential profit. By November 1st, Kerrigan had spent nearly 2 months documenting purchases he didn't understand for reasons he couldn't identify. He'd filled 20 pages in his ledger with notes, physical descriptions, chemical names, attempted synthesis pathways, failed theories. Most pharmacists would have dismissed the pattern as an odd coincidence, quirky customers with legitimate, if unusual, needs. Nothing to worry about. Most pharmacists would have moved on. Daniel Kerrigan couldn't move on. His particular cognitive wiring, the same trait that had allowed him to identify Dr. Hamill's pill mill in 1973, made it nearly impossible to ignore an unsolved pattern. Something was wrong. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it the way you feel a storm coming before the clouds arrive. But he couldn't articulate what was wrong or why these chemicals mattered, or what they might be used for. He began losing sleep. Margaret noticed him getting up at 2 in the morning, going down to his study, pulling out his ledger and reference books, working through calculations by lamplight. She asked if he was all right. He said yes, but he was lying, and she knew it. On Friday evening, November 3rd, Kerrigan was in his reading chair in the living room, catching up on the October issue of Chemical and Engineering News while Margaret watched Dallas on television and worked on a sweater she was knitting for Patrick. Most of the issue was devoted to petroleum chemistry and polymer research, subjects that held little interest for Kerrigan, but on page 47 he found an article titled Soviet Chemical Weapons Development: What Western Intelligence Knows. The article was based on recently declassified CIA report excerpts. It discussed the Soviet Union's ongoing research into chemical weapons, specifically a program that Western intelligence believed was focused on developing what the article called binary weapons, agents made from 2 separate precursor chemicals that were relatively safe to handle individually but deadly when combined. The article noted that this approach allowed Soviet intelligence to circumvent traditional detection methods because the precursor chemicals often had legitimate industrial or agricultural applications and could be purchased through normal commercial channels without raising suspicion. The article included a section on suspected precursor categories. Not specific compounds, the details remained classified, but general chemical families that Western intelligence believed the Soviets might be targeting: organophosphorus compounds, fluorinating agents, tertiary amines, phosphorus halides. Kerrigan felt his pulse accelerate. He read the passage 3 times, each time more slowly, making sure he understood what the article was suggesting. Then he got up from his chair, walked to his study, and retrieved his ledger from the filing cabinet where he kept it locked. He brought it back to the living room, sat down, and laid the ledger open next to the magazine article on the coffee table. Margaret glanced over from the television, saw his expression, and muted the sound. "Danny, what's wrong?" "I need to check something," he said. He began cross-referencing the chemicals in his ledger against the categories described in the article. Dimethylaminoethanol was a tertiary amine. Methylphosphonic dichloride was an organophosphorus compound. Triethylamine, another tertiary amine, commonly used in organic synthesis as a base. Phosphorus trichloride, a phosphorus halide. Sodium fluoride, a fluorinating agent. Every single chemical his unusual customers had purchased fell into categories that the CIA article suggested were relevant to Soviet binary weapons programs. Kerrigan closed the magazine and sat back in his chair. His hands were shaking slightly. Margaret asked again what was wrong. He told her he wasn't sure yet, that he needed to do more research, but that it might be something serious. He slept poorly that night. On Saturday morning, November 4th, Kerrigan opened the pharmacy 2 hours early. He'd told his weekend assistant, a college student named Tom, who helped on Saturdays, not to come in, that he needed to do inventory work alone. He brought his ledger, the Chemical and Engineering News article, his organic chemistry textbook from college, and a stack of pharmaceutical reference manuals. He spread everything across the pharmacy counter and began a systematic analysis of every chemical purchase he documented. Dimethylaminoethanol could serve as a precursor to acetylcholine analogs, compounds structurally similar to the neurotransmitter that controlled muscle function. In the wrong synthesis pathway, it could produce compounds that disrupted neurotransmission. Methylphosphonic dichloride was a direct precursor to nerve agents. The compound contained the phosphorus-oxygen core structure found in organophosphorus nerve agents like sarin and VX. Triethylamine was a common base used in organophosphorus synthesis to neutralize the hydrochloric acid byproducts that formed during certain reactions. Phosphorus trichloride was a starting material for creating phosphorus-based weapons. Kerrigan pulled out a yellow legal pad and began drawing synthesis pathways, connecting compounds through chemical reactions he remembered from his college coursework and from the field toxicology he'd learned in Korea. The pathways weren't complete. He didn't have enough information to identify a specific final product, but he could see clearly that these chemicals, in the correct stoichiometric ratios and with the proper reaction conditions, could produce something dangerous, very dangerous. He checked the quantities. Across 18 separate purchases documented in his ledger, his unusual customers had acquired approximately 12 kilograms of various precursor materials. He did rough calculations on how much final product that might yield, depending on synthesis efficiency and the specific agent being produced. Conservative estimate, 3 to 5 kilograms of a nerve agent compound. He tried to remember what he'd learned about nerve agent dosages in Korea. The lethal dose of VX, one of the deadliest known nerve agents, was approximately 10 milligrams through skin absorption. 5 kilograms was 5 million milligrams. Even accounting for significant waste in the synthesis process, the quantities his customers had purchased could theoretically produce enough nerve agent to kill hundreds of thousands of people. He checked his math 3 times, then a 4th. The numbers didn't change. At 11:30 a.m. on Saturday, November 4th, 1978, Daniel Kerrigan sat alone in his pharmacy, surrounded by ledgers and textbooks and legal pads covered in chemical structures, and understood with absolute certainty that someone was systematically acquiring components for nerve agent synthesis. The purchases were deliberate. The quantities were calculated. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. And the only people in the world who had both the knowledge and the motivation to conduct this kind of operation were Soviet intelligence services. He thought about what this meant. Soviet agents were operating in Milwaukee. They were collecting materials for chemical weapons. They were doing it methodically, patiently, spreading purchases across time and locations to avoid detection. They were using his pharmacy, his inventory, his professional services as an unwitting supplier to what might be an assassination operation, or a terror attack, or a capability demonstration, or something else entirely. The targets could be anyone. Political figures, military personnel, defense contractor employees, random civilians used as test subjects. The timeline was unknown. Had they completed their collection? Were they synthesizing the agent now? Had they already used it? Kerrigan felt a weight settle in his chest that had nothing to do with his heart and everything to do with moral responsibility. If people died, if this operation succeeded, he would have been part of it, unknowing but part of it nonetheless. He'd sold the chemicals. He'd enabled the procurement. The fact that he hadn't. Known didn't absolve him of the consequences. He spent the rest of Saturday organizing his evidence. He made copies of his ledger pages. He wrote detailed explanations of each chemical purchase, including synthesis pathways and potential products. He created a timeline showing the pattern of purchases across 14 months. He prepared everything as if he were assembling a case file, because that's exactly what he was doing. That evening at dinner, his children asked why he was so quiet. He said he was tired, which was true, and that he was working on something complicated, which was also true. After dinner, he told Margaret he thought he needed to call the FBI. She asked if it was dangerous. He said he didn't know, maybe, probably. She asked if he was sure. He said yes, he was sure. He didn't sleep that night. He lay in bed reviewing the calculations in his head, checking his reasoning, questioning whether he was seeing patterns that didn't exist, wondering if he was about to make a fool of himself by reporting to the FBI that he'd uncovered a Soviet spy ring based on nothing more than pharmacy records and organic chemistry textbooks. But every time he went through the evidence, he reached the same conclusion: espionage. On Monday morning, November 6, 1978, at 8:47 a.m., Daniel Patrick Kerrigan called the FBI's Milwaukee field office from the phone behind his pharmacy counter. He asked to speak to someone in counterintelligence. When the duty officer asked what this was regarding, Kerrigan said he had evidence of what might be a Soviet chemical weapons procurement operation. The duty officer asked him to hold. The hold music played for nearly 2 minutes. Then a different voice came on the line, a man who identified himself as Special Agent Thomas Burkhart. Burkhart asked Kerrigan to explain what he'd found. Kerrigan explained. He talked for 43 minutes, describing the pattern, the chemicals, the synthesis pathways, the quantities, the suspicious behavior of the purchasers, everything he'd documented over the previous 2 months, and everything he'd discovered on Saturday when the pieces finally fit together. When he finished, there was silence on the other end of the line for several seconds. Then Burkhart asked a single question. "Mr. Kerrigan, is this the same Daniel Kerrigan who helped us with the Dr. Hamill investigation in 1973? "Yes." Another pause. "I'll be at your pharmacy at 2:30 this afternoon. Please don't discuss this with anyone else." Special Agent Thomas Burkhart remembered Daniel Kerrigan from the 1973 investigation. When the duty officer told him a pharmacist was on the line claiming to have evidence of a Soviet chemical weapons network, and that pharmacist was named Kerrigan, Burkhart took the call personally. Burkhart was 42 years old, 15 years with the FBI, the last 8 in counterintelligence. He'd worked cases involving industrial espionage, technology theft, and suspected Soviet agents operating under diplomatic cover. He'd learned to distinguish between paranoid citizens seeing spies behind every curtain and legitimate sources reporting actual suspicious activity. The difference usually came down to documentation and coherence. Paranoid people had theories. Legitimate sources had evidence. Kerrigan had evidence. During their 43-minute phone conversation, Kerrigan walked Burkhart through 18 separate chemical purchases, provided physical descriptions of multiple purchasers, explained synthesis pathways with the precision of someone who actually understood organic chemistry, and described exactly why the pattern suggested nerve agent precursor acquisition rather than any legitimate commercial purpose. He didn't speculate wildly. He didn't claim certainty where he lacked information. He presented what he knew, acknowledged what he didn't know, and let the facts speak for themselves. Burkhart made notes. Then he consulted Dr. Patricia Chen, the FBI's staff chemist at the Milwaukee field office. He read her Kerrigan's list of chemicals and asked a single question. If someone wanted to synthesize a Soviet-style nerve agent using commercially available precursors, would these chemicals be plausible components? Dr. Chen reviewed the list for less than 30 seconds before answering. Yes. If you know what you're doing, absolutely yes. Burkhart called Special Agent Linda Martinez in Washington. Martinez was one of the FBI's chemical weapons specialists, someone who'd spent 6 years analyzing Soviet chemical warfare capabilities before transferring to counterintelligence field operations. She happened to be in Milwaukee that week on a separate case involving suspected technology transfer to Eastern Bloc countries. Burkhart briefed her on Kerrigan's report and asked if she could join him for the afternoon meeting. She said yes immediately. At 2:30 p.m. on November 6, 1978, Burkhart and Martinez walked into Kerrigan's pharmacy. Kerrigan had closed early, posting a sign on the door that said "Closed for inventory." They met in the small office behind the pharmacy counter, a cramped space with filing cabinets, a desk covered in paperwork, and barely enough room for 3 chairs. Kerrigan presented his evidence methodically. He showed them his ledger with 14 months of documented purchases. He provided physical descriptions of 5 or 6 different men who'd made the purchases, along with 8 license plate numbers he'd managed to record when the men had parked on the street within his line of sight. He explained each chemical's legitimate uses and why the combination of purchases suggested something illegitimate. He showed them his synthesis pathway diagrams on yellow legal pads, walked them through his calculations of potential final product yields, explained his 4 failed hypotheses about what the purchases might represent, and described the chemical and engineering news article that had finally allowed him to identify the pattern. Martinez asked technical questions. How did Kerrigan know the stoichiometric ratios? He explained the calculations. Could these chemicals be for legitimate industrial purposes? He explained why that didn't fit the purchasing pattern, the quantities, or the behavior of the buyers. Why come to the FBI now, 2 months after noticing the pattern? Because he'd only figured out what the chemicals were for on Saturday, November 4th, 3 days ago. Martinez reviewed the synthesis diagrams in silence for several minutes. Then she looked up at Burkhart and said 5 words that changed the investigation's trajectory. This is binary nerve agent procurement. Burkhart radioed the FBI field office while still sitting in Kerrigan's back office. He requested immediate motor vehicle checks on all 8 license plates. The results came back within 20 minutes. 3 plates were registered to addresses in Milwaukee. 2 were registered to addresses in Chicago suburbs. 1 was registered to a business in Kenosha. 1 was registered to an individual in Madison. And 1, the plate Kerrigan had recorded on October 7th, was diplomatic. Soviet Consulate, Chicago. The atmosphere in the small office changed immediately. Diplomatic plates meant Soviet diplomatic personnel, which meant this wasn't speculation anymore. This was an active Soviet intelligence operation involving chemical weapons procurement on American soil. Over the next 48 hours, the FBI documented everything. Agents photographed every page of Kerrigan's ledger. They took detailed statements. They interviewed Kerrigan's weekend assistant, who confirmed that several men matching Kerrigan's descriptions had made unusual chemical purchases and that the men had seemed nervous. The FBI accessed purchasing records from the wholesale suppliers Kerrigan used and confirmed that the chemicals he'd sold were high-purity laboratory grade, consistent with synthesis requirements rather than industrial applications. Simultaneously, the FBI ran a standard background check on Kerrigan himself. This was protocol. Before proceeding with an investigation based on a civilian's report, the Bureau needed to verify the source's reliability and rule out any indication that the source might be compromised, working for foreign intelligence, or mentally unstable. Kerrigan's background checked out perfectly. Korean War service with honorable discharge, no criminal record, no unusual financial transactions, no foreign contacts, no history of mental health issues. The 1973 Dr. Hamilpill Mill investigation was documented in FBI files, including a commendation noting that Kerrigan's reporting had been accurate, thorough, and professionally presented. The assessment concluded that Daniel Kerrigan posed no security risk and had a demonstrated history of reliable reporting on pharmaceutical irregularities. What Kerrigan didn't know, what Agent Burkhart didn't tell him during that first meeting, was that the FBI had been searching for evidence of Soviet chemical procurement operations for nearly 2 years. A CIA briefing in late 1976 had suggested that the Soviet Union was developing binary chemical weapons using precursor materials that could be sourced from Western commercial suppliers. The theory was that Soviet intelligence would circumvent traditional detection methods by purchasing small quantities of dual-use chemicals from multiple sources rather than manufacturing complete nerve agents that would require specialized facilities and would be easier to detect through signals intelligence or satellite reconnaissance. FBI counterintelligence had investigated potential procurement networks since early 1977. They'd focused on industrial chemical suppliers, university chemistry departments, defense contractors with chemical engineering divisions, and import-export businesses that handled chemicals. But every investigation had turned up nothing suspicious or had resulted in dead ends. The assumption had been that Soviet procurement would target high-volume suppliers or specialized facilities. No one at the FBI had seriously considered that Soviet intelligence might use retail pharmacies as procurement points. The strategy seemed counterintuitive. Pharmacies carried smaller quantities, charged higher prices, operated in public view with frequent customers who might notice unusual purchases. But those apparent disadvantages were actually advantages from an operational security perspective. Small quantities meant individual purchases drew no attention. Higher prices were irrelevant when the alternative was the impossibility of bulk purchasing without documentation. Public visibility provided cover through normalcy, and retail transactions, especially cash transactions, left minimal paper trail. Kerrigan's documentation represented the first concrete evidence the FBI had obtained of systematic Soviet chemical precursor procurement. By November 8th, the investigation had expanded beyond Milwaukee. FBI agents contacted 47 independent pharmacies in Milwaukee and surrounding counties, asking specifically about unusual purchases of organophosphorus compounds, fluorinating agents, tertiary amines, and related materials. The agents used cover stories about DEA compliance reviews to avoid alerting potential suspects that the FBI was investigating. 11 additional pharmacies reported purchases matching the pattern Kerrigan had identified. The FBI compiled the reports into a comprehensive database. 37 total transactions across 12 different locations over 14 months. The geographic distribution centered on Milwaukee, but extended to Madison, Green Bay, Kenosha, and the Chicago suburbs. Physical descriptions from multiple pharmacists confirmed that 4 to 6 different men were making the purchases. Several pharmacists had recorded partial license plate information that matched plates already identified through Kerrigan's documentation. When FBI analysts aggregated the quantities purchased across all locations, the numbers were alarming. Approximately 15 kilograms of various precursor materials had been acquired, enough to synthesize multiple kilograms of nerve agent, depending on synthesis efficiency and the specific compound being produced. On November 10th, the FBI sent a complete evidence package to CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The package included Kerrigan's ledgers, purchasing records from 11 other pharmacies, surveillance photographs from license plate traces, chemical analysis reports, and synthesis pathway assessments from FBI chemists. The request was urgent. CIA Chemical Weapons Division needed to evaluate whether the procurement pattern was consistent with known Soviet nerve agent programs and assess the potential threat. The CIA response came back on November 13th. The analysis confirmed that the chemical combinations were consistent with precursor acquisition for A232 or A234 Novichok agents, binary nerve agents that Soviet intelligence had been developing since the early 1970s. The assessment stated that quantities were sufficient for either multiple assassination operations or small-scale synthesis trials to test production protocols. The CIA warned that Soviet intelligence services sometimes tested synthesis procedures in adversary territory to avoid detection at home facilities and to verify that production could be conducted covertly using local materials. The CIA's conclusion was unambiguous. This represented a credible national security threat requiring immediate action. The question facing FBI counterintelligence was what kind of action to take. The obvious approach was immediate arrests, seizing the chemicals and shutting down the operation before any nerve agent could be synthesized. But that approach had a significant disadvantage. It would capture the procurement operatives but likely miss the operations coordinator, any laboratory facilities where synthesis might be occurring, and any other network members who hadn't personally made pharmacy purchases. The alternative was continued surveillance to map the complete network before making arrests. That approach carried its own risks. It gave the operation more time to proceed, potentially allowing nerve agent synthesis to be completed. It increased the chance that Soviet intelligence would detect FBI interest and abort the operation, allowing suspects to flee. But it offered the possibility of dismantling the entire network and understanding the operation's full scope. FBI Director William Webster, briefed on the investigation on November 14th, authorized continued surveillance with a short timeline. The Bureau would have 2 weeks to identify all network members, locate any synthesis facilities, and determine the operation's objectives. Then arrests would proceed regardless of whether the investigation was complete. The breakthrough in identifying who was coordinating the purchases came from Wisconsin license plate JKL 847, which Daniel Kerrigan had recorded on October 7th. The plate belonged to a 1976 Chevrolet Impala registered to Peter Kovacs, age 38, with an address in Racine. Kovacs was a naturalized U.S. citizen who'd immigrated in 1972, claiming refugee status from Hungary following the Prague Spring aftermath. He worked as a chemical technician at SC Johnson, the Racine-based consumer products company, where he had access to industrial chemical knowledge and procurement systems. On the surface, his background appeared legitimate. Deeper investigation revealed that Soviet-Hungarian state security had maintained extensive refugee infiltration programs during that period, placing intelligence operatives under cover of political asylum. FBI surveillance began on November 16th. For the first 2 days, Kovacs followed a normal routine: work, home, grocery store. On November 18th, he drove to Milwaukee and met a second individual at a coffee shop on Brady Street. The second man was Yuri Petrov, identified through FBI counterintelligence files as a known Soviet contact who worked as a translator at the Soviet consulate in Chicago. On November 20th, Petrov met with Dmitry Volkov, officially listed as a cultural attaché but identified by FBI counterintelligence as a probable GRU officer. The following day, agents observed Kovacs, Petrov, and 2 unidentified individuals entering a warehouse at 1247 58th Avenue in Kenosha, an industrial building listed in property records as vacant. Thermal imaging confirmed interior activity. On November 22nd, FBI surveillance teams documented delivery of laboratory equipment to the warehouse, distillation apparatus, reaction vessels, heating mantles, protective gear. By November 25th, the FBI had identified 7 individuals connected to the network beyond Volkov, who complicated matters with his diplomatic immunity. The network's structure became clear through surveillance: Volkov coordinating, Kovacs and 2 others conducting procurement, 4 others apparently handling technical and laboratory operations. On November 26th, FBI agents followed Kovacs to a private residence in Racine at 2814 Douglas Avenue. Property records showed ownership by a shell company, Midwest Industrial Consultants, LLC. The FBI obtained Title III authorization for wiretaps on national security grounds and established surveillance. Directional microphones captured conversation fragments in Russian, including technical chemistry terminology. Laboratory analysis of waste containers covertly obtained from the Kenosha warehouse revealed organophosphorus compound residues, confirming that precursor synthesis had already occurred. The FBI faced a decision. Volkov's diplomatic immunity meant he couldn't be arrested, only expelled. Arresting the others immediately would shut down the operation, but leave questions about targets and objectives unanswered. Continued surveillance risked allowing the operation to proceed further. After consultation with the State Department regarding diplomatic implications, the FBI chose coordinated arrests before Thanksgiving to prevent any potential operation from being executed. FBI teams finalized arrest plans on December 21st, targeting 7 suspects across Wisconsin, Illinois, and Minnesota for simultaneous 6 a.m. operations the following morning. Dmitry Volkov would be declared persona non grata and given 48 hours to leave the country. Federal prosecutors prepared espionage charges. Daniel Kerrigan, whose identity would remain classified, went to bed that evening unaware that his obsessive record-keeping had just prevented what investigators believed was either a Soviet assassination capability demonstration or active nerve agent weapons testing on American soil. At exactly 6 a.m. on December 22, 1978, a Friday morning 2 days before Christmas, FBI agents executed 7 simultaneous arrests across 3 states. Peter Kovacs was arrested at his Racine home. Yuri Petrov was taken into custody at his Chicago apartment. 3 others were arrested at the Kenosha warehouse during their night shift. 2 more were arrested at the Racine safe house. All suspects complied without resistance. The evidence seized told the story the FBI had suspected. The Kenosha warehouse contained a complete organic chemistry laboratory with distillation apparatus, reaction vessels, and protective equipment. Agents recovered approximately 8 kilograms of precursor chemicals in small quantities, estimated at 250 grams, of synthesized intermediate compounds. Laboratory notebooks documented synthesis procedures written in Russian. Critically, no complete nerve agent was found. The synthesis appeared incomplete. The Racine safe house yielded one-time cipher pads, shortwave radio equipment, detailed maps of Milwaukee, Madison, and Chicago with marked locations, surveillance photographs of federal buildings and defense contractors, Soviet operational manuals, and $47,000 in cash. Dmitry Volkov was formally declared persona non grata by the State Department on December 22nd and departed the United States on December 24th. The Soviet Union expelled 2 American diplomats in standard retaliation. The trial began in September 1979 in U.S. District Court, Eastern District of Wisconsin. 5 defendants were convicted on espionage charges in November, receiving sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years. Peter Kovacs received 25 years. 2 defendants were acquitted on evidentiary technicalities. Kovacs and Petrov were eventually exchanged in a 1985 prisoner swap for American intelligence officers held in the Soviet Union. Daniel Patrick Kerrigan's role in breaking the Soviet chemical weapons procurement network remained classified until 1997, known only to FBI officials, federal prosecutors, and his immediate family. He returned to operating Kerrigan's pharmacy, consulted occasionally with the FBI on pharmaceutical security matters, and retired in 1994 at age 63. His customers never knew. His community never knew. When the case was declassified in July 1997, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel ran a feature story about the local pharmacist who'd exposed a Soviet spy ring. Kerrigan, then 66, gave a brief interview, but seemed uncomfortable with the attention. He said he'd just done what any pharmacist should do: paid attention. The DEA had implemented new reporting requirements for precursor chemicals in 1980, adding many of the compounds the Soviet network had purchased to watch lists. The FBI created a national database for tracking unusual chemical purchase patterns. Kerrigan's ledger became training material, an example of professional vigilance. Daniel Patrick Kerrigan passed away on June 12, 2003, at age 72. Intelligence historians later concluded the operation had likely been intended as a capability demonstration, proving Soviet intelligence could synthesize Novichok agents using Western commercial chemicals without detection. In the vast apparatus of Cold War intelligence and counterintelligence, one neighborhood pharmacist's particular way of thinking, his photographic memory for chemical nomenclature, his obsessive ledger keeping, his understanding of synthesis pathways, achieved what billions of dollars in intelligence infrastructure had missed.